Master Chief Petty Officer John Carver, United States Navy SEAL, retired, had run out of road. After a divorce that felt more like an amputation and a decade of drifting that had finally killed his truck, he'd landed on a forgotten spit of coastal Maine with a rucksack, $200, and a scarred Belgian Malinois named Reaper. He was looking for a place to disappear, a place quiet enough to let the ghosts settle. But on the second day, inside the ruins of an abandoned Civil War fort he'd bought for $10, his old war dog froze, his entire body rigid, and began to claw at the stone floor of the powder room. Behind it waited a secret sealed for over 150 years, a secret that would drag Carver back into the world he'd tried to leave behind and give him a reason to fight again. The war he carried wasn't one for the history books. It was a private, festering wound from Ramadi, 2006. It lived in the grit he could still feel in his teeth, in the smell of superheated copper and vaporized concrete that ambushed him in his sleep. A pressure plate IED in a sun-baked alley, narrow as a grave. The blast had thrown him against a wall, a rag doll in body armor, while the world dissolved into a storm of dust and noise. The rest of his team, closer to the epicenter, had been consumed by it. He remembered the silence that followed, a ringing, absolute void where the shouts of his brothers should have been. And then, a wet nose pushing at his face, the scrape of claws, and the weight of a 70-pound dog dragging him by his vest out of the choking cloud. Reaper, then barely 2 years old, had saved his body. His mind was another matter. The man who came home was a stranger to his wife, Sarah. The quiet was gone, replaced by a coiled watchfulness she couldn't penetrate. He'd sit in a dark room for hours, his hand resting on Reaper's head, the only living thing that seemed to understand the language of his stillness. She called it living with a ghost, and eventually, the ghost had the decency to leave. His daughter, Maya, was a teenager then. He saw the way she looked at him, with a mixture of fear and pity that was worse than any anger. He'd tried to call, but the calls became shorter, the silences longer, until they stopped altogether. So he'd left, aiming himself at the empty parts of the map, taking odd jobs on fishing boats and logging crews, sleeping in the cab of his Ford until the transmission gave out, in a town whose name he never bothered to learn. He sold it for scrap, packed his rucksack, and started walking north with Reaper padding faithfully at his heel. He'd heard a story from an old fisherman in a bar about a piece of land nobody wanted, a ruin on a point sticking out into the Atlantic, a place the county would give away just to get it off the books. It sounded like the end of the line. It sounded perfect. The town was called Port Clyde, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to a granite shore, smelling of salt and diesel and low tide. The county annex was a small brick building where a man named Elias Thorne presided over deeds and titles from behind a mountain of yellowing paper. He was thin and stooped, with eyes that had seen generations of fishing boats go out, and not all of them come back. He looked at Carver, at the hard miles etched around his eyes and the set of his jaw, and he looked at the old dog lying patiently by the door, a map of old scars visible through his thinning coat. "Help you?" Thorne asked, his voice dry as rust. Carver explained what he was looking for. Fort Defiance, the old Union outpost on the point. Thorne raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Nobody's asked about that place in years. It's a liability. Collapsing walls, open cisterns. County took it for back taxes in '38. Been trying to get rid of it ever since." Carver slid a $10 bill across the counter. "I'll take it." Thorne studied him for a long moment, his gaze flicking from Carver's worn boots to the military bearing he couldn't quite shake. "You service?" Carver just nodded. Thorne sighed and began pulling a thick, dusty ledger from a shelf. "There's a $10 filing fee. That's it. It's yours." As he stamped the papers with a heavy, deliberate thud, he paused. "Place has a history, you know. not the kind they put on plaques. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. People get ideas, treasure hunters mostly. But there's others. A few years back, a developer from downstate named Blackwood started buying up all the land around the causeway, said he wanted to build a resort. Then a fella came through asking questions about him, about the family's history. An investigator or a writer, maybe. Stayed for a few months, then he was just gone. Vanished. Thorne pushed the deed across the counter. The Blackwoods don't like neighbors they can't control. You watch yourself out there. Carver took the paper, folded it, and put it in his pocket. A warning was more than he'd gotten from anyone in years. He nodded his thanks and walked out into the sharp, clean air, Reaper rising to meet him. The fort was a 20-minute walk down a dirt track that ended at a narrow strip of land connecting the point to the mainland. It was less a fort and more a skeleton of one, granite blocks the size of coffins, green with moss and lichen. The wind howled through empty gun emplacements, a constant, lonely sound. But beneath the rot and ruin, the stone was solid. It was a defensible position. For a man who felt like he was under siege from his own memories, it felt like coming home. He and Reaper made their camp in the most intact structure, the old powder magazine. It was a low, vaulted chamber, built half into the earth, with thick stone walls that cut the wind to a whisper. It was dry, dark, and secure. Carver unrolled his sleeping bag, shared his last can of beans with the dog, and for the first time in a decade, slept through the night without the familiar jolt of falling masonry and incoming fire. The next morning, the sky was a hard, clear blue. He set about exploring his new kingdom, pacing the collapsed ramparts, testing the stability of the remaining walls. Reaper followed, his tail giving a few slow, contented thumps whenever Carver stopped to look out at the churning gray water of the Atlantic. It was on the afternoon of the second day that it began. They were back in the powder room, Carver organizing his meager supplies, when Reaper suddenly went rigid. His head cocked, his ears swiveling forward. A low whine started deep in his chest, a sound Carver hadn't heard since their last tour. The dog walked to the far corner of the room and stopped, his nose inches from the flagstone floor. He stared at it, unblinking. "What is it, boy?" Carver asked. "Rat?" But this wasn't the excited energy of a dog on a hunt. This was something else. A focused, almost obsessive intensity. Reaper ignored him. He lowered his head and began to paw at one specific stone, his claws making a dry, scraping sound. Carver tried to call him off, offering him a piece of jerky, but the dog wouldn't be moved. He refused food, refused water, his entire being concentrated on that single spot on the floor. Carver wrote it off as the strangeness of a new place, the scent of some long-dead animal trapped beneath the stones. He took Reaper for a long walk along the rocky beach, throwing a piece of driftwood until his own arm ached. The dog played, but his attention was divided, his head constantly turning back toward the fort. The moment they stepped back inside the powder magazine, he went straight back to the corner, the low whine returning, more insistent now. It went on for hours. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the stone floor, and the dog's behavior escalated. He began to dig in earnest, his powerful front paws scrabbling uselessly at the unyielding surface. A growl joined the whine, a deep, guttural rumble of frustration. Carver had seen that dog locate buried explosives with less certainty. Finally, his own patience worn thin, he knelt beside Reaper. All right, I get it." He placed his hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension vibrating through him. He ran his hand over the flagstones, feeling the cold, rough-hewn surface. Then he knocked on them. The first one returned a solid, dead thud. The second, the same. But when he knocked on the stone Reaper had been clawing at, the sound was different. It was a dull, hollow boom, like knocking on a sealed drum. It absorbed the sound instead of reflecting it. He ran his calloused fingertips along the edges. 3 sides were rough, sealed with crumbling mortar. But the 4th side, the one against the wall, was a clean, straight line. Too clean. It wasn't a crack from a century of settling. It was a seam. He looked at Reaper, who sat watching him, panting softly, his dark eyes filled with an unwavering certainty. The dog knew. From the moment they'd walked in, the dog had known. Finding a pry bar wasn't hard. The fort was littered with the rusted detritus of its past. He found a 3-foot length of iron, once part of a cannon mounting, and wedged the flattened end into the clean seam. He put his weight into it, his muscles screaming in protest. The stone didn't budge. He repositioned, found better leverage, and tried again. The iron groaning against the granite. Sweat beaded on his forehead and ran into his eyes, stinging. Reaper stood a few feet away, watching, a quiet tension in his posture. For an hour, Carver worked, chipping away at the old mortar, grunting with the effort, the rhythmic scrape and screech of metal on stone echoing in the small chamber. Finally, with a deafening shriek of protest, the flagstone shifted. It slid sideways, grating against its neighbors, revealing a dark, square opening. A wave of cold, stale air washed over him, smelling of damp earth, old paper, and something else. A faint, metallic tang like old blood or rust. He shone his small flashlight into the hole. It wasn't a cistern or a crawlspace. It was a deliberate chamber, lined with fitted stones, and a short, wooden ladder descended into the blackness. The rungs were thick, made of oak, and looked surprisingly solid. He checked them, putting his full weight on the top one before committing. They held. He clipped the flashlight to his belt, told Reaper to stay, and began the climb down. The space below was small, no more than 6 feet square, and just tall enough for him to stand upright. In the center of the dirt floor sat a heavy, sea-worn chest, bound with iron straps green with verdigris. The lock was a massive, rusted thing that broke apart under a few sharp blows from the pry bar. He lifted the heavy lid. His breath caught in his throat. It was filled with gold coins, neatly stacked, gleaming dully in the beam of his flashlight. They were Union eagles, double eagles, heavy and real, a fortune that could change a man's life, or end it. But there was something else. On top of the gold sat a small bundle wrapped in oilskin and tied with waxed cord. He carefully lifted it out. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but perfectly preserved in the dry, still air. Next to it lay a single firearm, an 1861 Colt Navy revolver, its metal coated in a thin layer of protective grease, its walnut grip smooth and dark. He picked up the journal and opened it. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script. Property of Captain Elias Vance, 20th Maine Infantry, Fort Defiance Command, October 1865. Carver sat on the edge of the chest and began to read. Vance had been the fort's last commander, left with a skeleton crew after Lee's surrender. He wrote of a conspiracy, of senior officers in the regional command working with a local businessman to divert a massive Army payroll shipment. They were war profiteers, planning to smuggle the gold to Europe. Vance discovered the plot and, unable to trust anyone, took the gold himself and hid it, along with the ledger book detailing the names, dates, and amounts. As Carver read, a chill went down his spine. Vance wrote not just of the crime, but of the war itself. "Do I see their faces when I close my eyes?" one entry read. "The boys from Gettysburg, their bodies broken on the rocks. We fought for the Union, for an idea. And for what? So men in fine coats could grow rich on our blood?" It was the same hollow ache Carver felt, the same bitter betrayal. The last entry was dated November 12th, 1865. They know I am here. A man named Blackwood, a shipping magnate from the town, has been by the fort twice. His questions are too sharp, his eyes too hungry. He is one of them. I have sealed this chamber. If you are reading this, it means I did not survive to see justice done. The gold is a burden, but the ledger is the truth. Do not let them bury it again. For God's sake, do not let them bury the truth with me. Carver looked up from the page, the name echoing in the small, dark space. Blackwood. The same name the clerk, Elias Thorne, had warned him about. This wasn't a dead secret. It was a sleeping one. And he had just woken it up. The discovery flipped a switch deep in his mind. The hollow resignation that had been his companion for years burned away, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a mission. He was no longer a drifter hiding from the world. He was a sentry on a post. His training, dormant for so long, came rushing back. Before he even climbed out of the chamber, he was thinking about security, about fields of fire and lines of approach. He put the journal and the Colt revolver in his rucksack, leaving the gold for now. He heaved the heavy flagstone back into place, scraping dirt and gravel into the seam, using a wet mixture of crushed moss and earth to disguise the clean edge until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding stones. The fort was no longer a shelter. It was a defensive position. He spent the rest of the day observing, not as a homeless veteran, but as a SEAL conducting a site survey. He paced the perimeter, noting the blind spots, the natural choke points. The only land access was the narrow causeway, a perfect kill zone. The sea approaches were guarded by treacherous rocks and a violent surf. Captain Vance had chosen his final outpost well. The next afternoon, he saw it, a flash of light from the thick woods on the mainland, just across the water from the causeway. It was gone in an instant, but he knew what it was. Sunlight glinting off the lens of a binocular or a rifle scope. Someone was watching him. Reaper knew it too. The dog stood beside him on the rampart, his body low and tense, a growl vibrating in his chest, his gaze fixed on the exact spot in the trees where the glint had appeared. They were not alone. An hour later, a brand new Ford F-250, a color so black it seemed to drink the light, rolled down the dirt track and stopped at the causeway. A man got out. He was in his early 40s, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen a speck of mud. He had a handsome, confident face and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked toward the fort with an easy stride, as if he owned it. "Hello there," he called out. "Mind if I come over?" Carver met him at the edge of the fort's ruined gatehouse, Reaper standing silently at his side, a formidable shadow. "This is private property," Carver said, his voice flat. The man's smile widened. "Well, that's what I came to talk about. My name is Marcus Blackwood." He extended a hand. Carver ignored it. "My family has owned most of the coastline around here for generations. I heard from the folks in town that someone was squatting out here. Old Thorne at the clerk's office, his memory isn't what it used to be. I'm sure whatever arrangement you think you have is a misunderstanding." Blackwood's eyes scanned the ruins, lingering on the powder magazine. "I'm prepared to make you a generous offer to clear out. We're putting together a conservation trust." Reaper took a half step forward, the growl now an audible threat. Blackwood's eyes flicked down to the dog, his smile tightening for a fraction of a second. "That's a fine-looking animal," he said, his tone suddenly slick with false sincerity. "He military?" "He's retired," Carver said. Blackwood's gaze moved back to Carver, probing, assessing. "Find anything interesting in these old rocks? People say there's all sorts of history buried out here." The question was casual, but it hung in the air like a charge. "Just rocks," Carver replied. Blackwood finally seemed to accept he would get nothing more. He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back to his truck. As the F-250 drove away, Carver's eyes swept the area where it had been parked. He walked over to the causeway and found what he was looking for in the dirt: a freshly discarded cigarette butt. It was a Marlboro. He remembered clearly that the ashtray in Blackwood's truck had been full of butts from a different brand, a slim, filtered cigarette. There had been two of them out here today, one to watch and one to talk. Carver knew he couldn't stay isolated. He was outmanned and outgunned, and the enemy owned the terrain. He needed supplies, and more importantly, he needed intelligence. He took 5 of the Double Eagle gold coins, wrapped them in a cloth, and buried them in his pack. The next morning, before dawn, he and Reaper slipped off the peninsula, moving through the woods, circling wide around the spot where the Watcher had been. He walked 5 miles to the next town over and caught a bus heading south, ending up in a place called Rockland, a larger port town where a man like him wouldn't draw as much attention. He found a pawn shop run by a tired-looking man with a Navy anchor tattooed on his forearm. Carver put one of the coins on the counter. The pawnbroker picked it up, his eyes widening as he examined it. He looked up at Carver, a question in his eyes. "My grandfather's," Carver said, a simple lie. "Found it clearing out his attic." The man nodded slowly, accepting the story he was being offered. He gave Carver a fair price in cash, no questions asked. With the money, Carver bought the essentials: a small, quiet generator, a gas can, lanterns, canned food, a new set of bolt cutters, and a cheap burner phone. He was re-equipping. His last stop was a surplus store where he bought a powerful set of binoculars. On the bus ride back, he felt the old instincts humming, the familiar rhythm of mission prep. He was no longer just surviving, he was operating. That night, he went back to see Elias Thorne. He found the old clerk working late, the only light in the county annex burning in his office. Carver knocked on the glass. Thorne looked up, startled, then unlocked the door. "I thought you might be back," he said, his expression grim. Carver didn't show him the gold, but he laid Captain Vance's journal on the desk. "I need you to read this," he said, "especially the last page." Thorne put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read. As he absorbed Vance's final words, all the color drained from his face. He looked up at Carver, his hand trembling slightly. "Blackwood," he whispered. "My God, my great-grandfather used to tell stories. He said the first Blackwood came here after the war with nothing and built a shipping empire overnight. He said it was blood money, but no one knew how." Thorne, now an ally bound by the weight of his town's history, became Carver's archivist. He pulled out older, forgotten ledgers from a back room, books bound in cracking leather. Together, they spent hours tracing the Blackwood family's initial land acquisitions. They found what the journalist Peterson must have found: forged deeds, property transfers signed by men who had died at Antietam, a pattern of theft and intimidation stretching back to 1866, all originating from the wealth that had appeared out of nowhere. "Peterson came to me with some of this," Thorne said, his voice low. "He was getting close. He was going to publish. Then he went for a hike up on the ridge and his car was found empty a week later. They called off the search after a month." Carver knew Peterson hadn't gotten lost. He'd been silenced, just like Vance. When Carver returned to the fort near midnight, he found the message he had been expecting. The heavy chain he'd looped through the gatehouse stones had been cut clean through with bolt cutters. The ends had then been twisted crudely back together. It wasn't an attempt to be subtle. It was a statement. "We can get to you whenever we want." He stood in the darkness, listening to the wind and the sea, Reaper a warm, solid presence at his side. Later that night, as a sliver of moon cast a pale light on the water, he saw it through his new binoculars. A small boat, running without lights, moving slowly past the point. A figure on the bow was sweeping the shoreline with a night vision device, its faint green glow an unnatural eye in the dark. The net wasn't just tightening, it was closing. The storm rolled in 2 nights later, a furious nor'easter that threw sheets of rain against the granite walls and churned the sea into a white, frothed chaos. The wind shrieked through the ruins, a perfect cover for sound and movement. Carver had been expecting them. He'd spent the last 2 days preparing, not just securing his position, but turning the entire fort into a weapon. He'd created tripwires from fishing line connected to stacks of empty cans. He'd mapped out every shadow, every piece of solid cover, every fatal funnel. He sat in the darkness of the powder magazine, the old Colt revolver cleaned, oiled, and loaded, resting on his lap. It was Reaper who gave him the first warning. The dog, lying at his feet, lifted his head, a growl so low it was more a vibration than a sound. His ears were swiveled toward the landward side of the fort. They were here. Carver moved without a sound, melting into the deeper shadows of a collapsed barracks. Through the driving rain, he saw 2 figures, clad in black, moving with a fluid, professional grace. They weren't local thugs hired by Blackwood. They were pros. One carried a gas can. Their objective wasn't just to recover the gold. It was to erase the fort, the journal, and him, all in one fiery stroke. He watched as they split up, one moving to douse the old wooden-roofed supply building, while the other began a methodical sweep toward the magazine. Carver let the first man pass his position. He was the distraction. The second man was the threat. As the man rounded the corner of a granite wall, Carver stepped out of the shadows behind him. He didn't use the gun. A gunshot would bring the other one running. He used his hands, his knife, and the brutal, efficient knowledge of human anatomy that had been drilled into him for 20 years. It was over in seconds. A swift, silent takedown that left the man unconscious and zip-tied with his own restraints. But the sound of the scuffle, muted as it was by the storm, had alerted the other man. Carver heard a sharp, questioning whistle. He dragged the unconscious man behind the wall just as a flashlight beam cut through the rain. The beam swept across the ruins, pausing, searching. And then the second man made his mistake. He saw the open door to the powder magazine and assumed Carver was cornered inside. He raised his suppressed pistol and moved toward the doorway. At that exact moment, as the man's attention was fixed forward, Reaper launched himself from the darkness to the man's right flank. He was a 70-pound blur of fur and teeth, hitting the man's leg with the force of a battering ram. The man yelled in surprise and pain, stumbling, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. He tried to bring his pistol around to shoot the dog, and that's when Carver moved. But the man was fast. He recovered his footing, shoving the dog away and leveling the weapon at Carver's chest. Time seemed to slow. He saw the muzzle flash, a tiny spark in the storm. He didn't feel the bullet, because it wasn't for him. Reaper, seeing the gun aimed at Carver, had lunged again, this time for the weapon itself. The shot caught the dog high in the shoulder, a wet, sickening thud. Reaper let out a sharp cry of pain, a sound that cut through Carver like a white-hot blade. The dog fell, his leg buckling beneath him, but his jaws were still clamped on the man's arm. That sound, Reaper's pain, erased the last 2 decades of weariness and grief from Carver's soul. The fog of Ramadi vanished, replaced by a terrible, cold clarity. He closed the distance in 2 steps. The fight was short and final. He didn't kill the man, but he broke his arm and his will to fight. He secured him next to his partner, then knelt by Reaper's side. The dog was whimpering, blood matting his dark fur, but he licked Carver's hand, his tail giving a weak thump against the wet ground. Using their radio, Carver bypassed the local sheriff. He called the state police barracks 50 miles away. "This is Master Chief John Carver, retired," he said, his voice steady and hard as iron. I am at Fort Defiance on Port Clyde Point. I am defending my property from 2 armed assailants. I have them detained. I have an animal injured. Requesting assistance. The dispatcher, taken aback by the calm authority in his voice, could only manage a quiet, "Yes, sir." The arrival of the Maine State Police was like a dam breaking. The 2 troopers who responded were cautious at first, but the scene spoke for itself. 2 professional-looking men, zip-tied and injured, the cans of gasoline, the suppressed weapons. Carver presented his deed, his military ID, and a concise, factual account of the assault. The 2 captured men, facing serious federal charges, broke quickly. They were private security contractors from Boston, hired by Marcus Blackwood for a recovery and demolition job. Their testimony was the first crack in the Blackwood family's century-and-a-half-old wall of silence. When the state detectives brought in Elias Thorne, the cracks widened into a fissure. Thorne provided Captain Vance's journal and the meticulously documented land fraud he and Carver had uncovered. The ledger, with its names and dates, was a historical bombshell, a direct link from the stolen Union gold to the foundation of the Blackwood fortune. The investigation into the disappearance of the journalist Peterson was reopened with new urgency. Marcus Blackwood was arrested at his waterfront estate, his confident smile finally gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. The powerful name, a name that had commanded fear and respect in that part of Maine for generations, crumbled into dust. While the legal storm raged, Carver's focus was singular. He carefully carried Reaper to his truck and drove him to a veterinary clinic in the next town. The vet was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and capable hands, a former Army medic who recognized the bond between the man and his dog immediately. She worked on Reaper for hours. The bullet had shattered part of his shoulder blade, but it had missed the vital organs. "He's tough," she said to Carver, who hadn't left the waiting room. "He'll have a bad limp, but he'll live." Reaper survived, a new scar joining the old ones, a physical testament to his unwavering loyalty. Weeks later, with the legal proceedings handed off to the authorities, Carver stood on the fort's highest rampart. The autumn sun was warm on his face, and the sea was calm. He looked out over the water, Reaper resting at his feet, his head on Carver's boot. The gold was a burden, as Vance had written. It wasn't his. He met with Elias Thorne and a lawyer, and began the process of creating a foundation. Using the recovered gold as its endowment, the Fort Defiance Foundation would restore the old fort not as a tourist attraction, but as a retreat. A quiet, peaceful place for veterans who, like him, had run out of road and needed a place to stop, to breathe, to find their way back. It would be a place to honor Captain Vance's duty and give purpose to his sacrifice. One evening, sitting by a small fire, he took out his burner phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang 3 times before she answered. "Hello?" Maya's voice was hesitant, cautious. "It's Dad," he said. For the first time in years, the words came easily. He told her everything, about the fort, the dog, the gold, the fight. He didn't make excuses for his absence. He just told her the truth of where he was now. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "I'd like you to see it sometime," he said finally. "The fort. And Reaper, he'd like to meet you." He heard her take a breath. "Okay, Dad," she said softly. "Okay." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. He looked down at the sleeping dog, whose quiet courage had started it all. The $10 he'd spent on this pile of rocks, the place he'd come only to disappear, had ended up being the thing that saved him. It hadn't just given him a mission. It had given him back his life. Some things don't stay buried. Truth, guilt, a soldier's sense of duty. They have a way of working their way to the surface, even after a century and a half of silence. For John Carver, the truth came in the form of a dog who wouldn't let go of a single stone, a dog who remembered his duty long after the man had tried to forget his. The loyalty of an animal, pure and uncomplicated, became the anchor in the storm of the past. It held him steady while the ghosts of two wars, one fought with cannons and one with roadside bombs, finally found their peace. The fort was no longer a ruin. It was a sanctuary. The gold was no longer a treasure. It was a tool for rebuilding broken lives. And the man who had come there with nothing left to lose found he had everything to fight for. A dead captain's honor, a future for men like him, and the quiet promise of a daughter's voice on the phone. In the end, the most valuable thing Captain Vance had left behind wasn't the gold. It was a second chance, waiting patiently in the dark for the right man to find it.